to him. I've been studying the Walker family of Barre for more than 50 years. And I'm with the Barre Historical Commission and the Barre Historical Society. So I look forward to telling you the story of Prince Walker. If Prince Walker were to come alive under the bramble and brush which cover his grave, he would tell how his brother, Quock Walker, brought an official end to slavery in Massachusetts. These words were written on March 11, 1958, in an article in the Evening Gazette, reporting on efforts of the Barre Historical Society to honor the 100th anniversary of Prince Walker's death in 1858. At that time, the Prince Walker burial ground was neglected. This oil painting that you see on the screen was done by Frank Bly, an artist from Hardwick, done in 1990. At that time, Prince Walker's gravestone, which is at far left, the tallest one, still was standing, although it was cracked. Since that time, it fell down and through an Eagle Scout project, with approval, was cemented into the ground for preservation. Prince Walker's children bought this gravestone for him. The other stones you see there have no inscriptions, and they are of Prince Walker's first wife and the 4 children who died young in this family. The burial ground is up on a hillside, very remote in the Ware River Watershed, and it's inaccessible by vehicle, and therefore maintenance of it has been difficult. And it is the only known vestige of a very remarkable man who we're going to talk about today. In my opinion, Prince Walker's story is more interesting than his brother, Quock Walker, who is credited with being the person who helped emancipate all slaves in Massachusetts in 1783 after he went through a suit for personal freedom. And although Quock's actions were beneficial for most enslaved people in Massachusetts, Prince, his much younger brother, actually fared worse because of them. Prince's case shows how enslavers could circumvent the law. Prince was born enslaved in Barre, Massachusetts in 1774, was sold to another enslaver in Connecticut when he was 9, when slavery was declared unconstitutional in Massachusetts. Stayed in Connecticut for 12 years, then escaped slavery just before his 21st birthday, returned to Barre, and started a large family and became a landowner and a farmer in Barre. Yet for all of these years, Prince Walker had to evade fugitive slave hunters who had the right to seize him in Massachusetts, even though slavery was not legal in Massachusetts. Prince's story is one of courage and resistance and persistence. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shows the green area of the Ware River Watershed in Barre. This is the very east portion of Barre. If you look carefully, you can see the diamond lines going from the left to the right. Rutland and Oakham are in the bottom corner, and Hubbardston's in the upper right corner. So you see Route 62 crossing through there. Prince was born on the estate of James Caldwell, later Nathaniel Jennison, and he spent his adult life on his own property up on the other side of Route 62, up on a hilltop in the watershed, about 1.7 miles north of James Caldwell's place. Next slide, please. This is an illustration from an article that I wrote for the American Ancestors magazine in summer of 2019. The figure you see is a common type of graphic that was used in runaway slave ads in the newspapers of the 1700s and 1800s. This is appropriate for Prince Walker because he did actually escape on foot from his enslaver in Connecticut, and his escape was advertised in the newspapers. The story of Prince Walker holds great importance today because of the era in which he lived and the tough times he survived. He was born in 1774 9 years before slavery ended in Massachusetts. Those 9 years included the entirety of the American Revolutionary War. His long life ended in 1858 at the age of 84 years. Few people born into slavery in Massachusetts were still alive in 1858. He's probably one of the last survivors. Prince's story started long before he was born in Barre on June 24th, 1774. Prince's birth happened just 8 days after the incorporation of Barre as a town under the name of Hutchinson, and a year before the Declaration of Independence. Many of the circumstances that impacted Prince's life resulted from a cloud of politics and personal relationships that formed long before he was born. Born on the cusp of a new order, a new society, and a new world, Prince was a person destined for special things. Next slide, please. This is a printed bill of sale taken from the original handwritten one, which somehow Nathaniel Jennison, Quock Walker's enslaver in Barre, produced during Quock Walker's trial for personal freedom in between 1781 and 1783. This is a typical bill of sale from the mid-1700s in Massachusetts. Rutland District is what Barre was called at that time before it was incorporated. Rutland District, May 4th, 1754, sold this day to Mr. James Caldwell of said district in the county of Worcester and province of Massachusetts Bay, a certain Negro man named Mingo, about 20 years of age, and also one Negro wench named Dinah, about 19 years of age, with her child Quacko, about 9 months old, all sound and well, for the sum of 108 pounds lawful money, received to my full satisfaction, which Negroes I, the subscriber, do warrant and defend against all claims whatsoever, as witness my hand, Zedekiah Stone, and it was done in the presence of John Murray and John Caldwell. We'll hear more about both of them. Zedekiah Stone, the seller, was from Petersham, and perhaps Quock was born in Petersham. We don't know. His parents may have been born in this country, but it is also possible they were born in the Caribbean. Most historians agree that the majority of Africans who came to colonial New England came first from the British colonies and not directly from Africa. And we will see how some of this plays out. Next slide, please. Quock Walker had a nephew named after him, Quock Walker Lewis. He was also Prince Walker's nephew, the son of one of their sisters. He was a leading abolitionist. And this is the only image that I have found of any of the first 2 or 3 generations of this family. The extended Walker family provides many examples of resistance to slavery. Mingo, Prince's father, ran away in 1765, but was probably returned to Barre. Quock, Prince's older brother, defied Nathaniel Jennison in 1781 and fought 2 years for his personal freedom, and that fight ended up in the emancipation of all slaves in Massachusetts. Prince, who was sold by Nathaniel Jennison into slavery in Connecticut, escaped at the age of 21, returned to Barre. He eluded fugitive slave hunters for years, and their sister, Prince's and Quock's, Minor Walker Lewis, moved from Barre to Cambridge with her large family, where many of her children were involved in abolitionist and civil rights activities, including Quock Walker Lewis. Taken as a whole, the Walker family exhibited a desire and ability to resist slavery and to forge their own ways in life. Next slide, please. This photograph shows the house on Granger Road that James Caldwell built about 1750 for his bride, Isabella Oliver of Athol, who in later records was called Isabel. And this is where the Walker family came to live in 1754. Legend tells us that James came to Barre about 1737 and spent his first winter under a sheltering ledge near this house and then built a crude cabin in which he lived. This house he built later was very fine for the frontier district of Barre, with chimney bricks imported from Europe. It is the oldest known house in Barre. It's on a small private parcel of property surrounded by Ware River Watershed. This is where Mingo, Dinah, and Quock came to live in May 1754. I believe that Zedekiah Stone sold this young enslaved family to James Caldwell because with an infant, the family was not all that productive and useful to Zedekiah Stone. But the Caldwells had just had their first baby in 1754, Sarah. And Dinah, as she was nursing Quacko, could also be a wet nurse for their little Sarah. An intimate relationship must have developed between the Caldwells and the Quock's family. This may account for the promise by James Caldwell and later by his wife Isabel to free Quock when he was grown. This promise was not honored by future enslaver Nathaniel Jennison, and this deceit was a factor in the emancipation of all persons in Massachusetts in 1783. Next slide, please. This is the sheltering ledge where James Caldwell lived his first winter, close to the house up behind it. It looks small, but as you can see, a 6-foot-tall person can stand easily in the entrance. Next slide. It's a beautiful place. These are recent photographs. Winter is beautiful there with the rocks and the snow. Next slide. But there was so much work to be done in the 1750s to turn this into a profitable estate. When James Caldwell died in 1763, his estate encompassed 1,152 acres. His only help in turning this wilderness into a productive farm appears to have been the Walker family. By some miracle, this beautiful home has been preserved in its isolated location near the junction of the Ware and Burnshire rivers, nestled next to the Ware River Watershed. It has been beautifully updated and maintained. Next slide. There were other people that were very important and would prove instrumental in the world of the Caldwell and Walker families. One was Colonel John Murray, whom you see at left, and the other was Judge John Chandler at right. Now, these two men were actually brothers-in-law. There was a large circle of influential men who were leaders in Worcester, Rutland, Barre, Athol, and Peter Sam, and most of them served in the military in the colonial wars together, so they had a bond of brotherhood that way. These two men figured prominently in the lives of the Caldwell family, and anything that happened to the Caldwell family trickled down to the Walker family. Colonel John Murray became the guardian of James Caldwell's children when James died in 1763. Judge John Chandler was instrumental in the administration of James Caldwell's probate, starting at his death in 1763. But these two men were loyalists, and they fled the Barre area in August of 1774, leaving the Caldwell and Walker families vulnerable. Next slide, please. Life was probably pretty smooth for about 9 years after the Walker family moved to the James Caldwell estate in Barre in 1754. But then one day, July 18th, 1763, when Quock was almost 10, he was out harrowing in the fields, and a storm came by. By its description, I tend to think it's a tornado. There have been several tornadoes right in that area. James Caldwell was killed by a tree that fell on him. With him was a Negro who suffered a broken thigh, according to the news articles, and this was probably Quock's father, Mingo. The widow, Isabel Caldwell, had her hands full when her husband, James, died so suddenly and unexpectedly without a will in the prime of his life. She had 4 children under the age of 11, and a 5th child was on the way. She had a family of enslaved dependents, all of them her children, and the Walker family had to be fed and clothed and housed. After delivering her daughter Submit several months after James's death, about October 1763, Isabel ordered a tombstone from Boston's famous carver, Henry Christian Guyer, and had it sledded to Boston. It now sits deep in the woods in the Ware River Watershed. Next slide, please. To add to Isabel's problems, the one man she really depended on left her in May of 1765. Can you imagine the pressure that Mingo must have felt to keep this huge estate going without his former master? We believe that Mingo was returned by some means. An inventory of the estate done 2 years later says there was an adult Negro male. There were no names in these inventories. They were counted like the sheep and the cattle. And there were 2 more children born, Rosanna and Prince, so he probably returned. Now, when you read runaway slave ads, they give an immense amount of information about the person's age and physical description, but they're kind of brutal to hear. This says, ran away from his mistress Isabel Caldwell of Rutland District in the county of Worcester the 25th of May last. A Negro man about 30 years of age named Mingo, speaks middling good English, a sprightly little fellow about 5 feet and 5 or 6 inches high, and it gives a description of his clothing, and Isabel Caldwell offered a reward of $4 for his return. So when we speak about the Walker family, which would be Mingo, Dinah, Quock, Prince, and other siblings, we do not know the exact relationship of them. There's been a lot of speculation about whether Quock was the father of Prince. Legal documents indicate he was a brother, but we can't know because there are no birth records. What we do know is that these individuals all eventually assumed the surname Walker. They maintained a strong relationship, a familial relationship, despite the differences in ages and the separations they endured and all the troubles that befell them. So they were a family more than many families that had more advantages. The mother, Dinah, died in 1799. Now, on March 28, 1769, Isabel Oliver Caldwell, James's widow, married a wealthy Barre bachelor, Nathaniel Jennison, 37 years old. In this way, Jennison acquired her property and sold Prince into slavery, eventually in Connecticut. Next slide, please. The Walker family should never have fallen into the grasp of Nathaniel Jennison. This document here was a decree by John Chandler, whom we saw earlier, judge of probate, stating in 1769, after Isabel had already married Nathaniel Jennison, that she was to receive her 1/3 of the estate of James Caldwell as her dower for the rest of her natural life. Her children got the other 2/3, and when she died, they would get her 1/3. She was already married to Jennison. He did not get any share of this property, but he was able to argue later, because there was nobody left to defend the Caldwell children, that he owned the slaves and her property. The interests of the Caldwell children were supposed to be protected by their guardian, John Murray, who was the one that signed the bill of sale for the slaves. We met him earlier. Isabel's second marriage disrupted the lives of both the Walkers and the Caldwells. Isabel disappeared mysteriously about 1773. Jennison said she died, but there's really no evidence. And then Nathaniel Jennison claimed he derived his property from her and the slaves through his marriage to her, even though this decree says differently. In many cases, this would have been true, but not in this case. Jennison also refused to honor the Caldwell's promise to free Quock when he became an adult, which led to Quock Walker's personal freedom suit in the emancipation of all slaves in Massachusetts. Sadly, this decision also led to Prince Walker being sold into slavery in Connecticut, which makes his case unique. Next slide, please. This is a small excerpt from the First Church records of Barre, Massachusetts, showing the very top line: baptisms male, Prince, servant of N. Jennison, 6 November 1774. Slaves did not have surnames. They were not baptized by their parents. They were baptized by their enslaver, which is one reason they are so hard to trace in a family history way. Presumably, Isabel died before August 4th, 1774, when Nathaniel Jennison married a wealthy widow from Roxbury, Mehitable Williams Shirley. Nathaniel Jennison was able to assume some of Isabel's property as his own, despite the probate court decree. Although Jennison was no longer married to Isabel, I believe he stayed right there on the James Caldwell farm after Isabel's death and his marriage to Mehitable. Next slide, please. A series of events in the first 4 months of Prince Walker's life had a profoundly negative impact on his future. June 24th, 1774, Prince was born. August 4th, 1774, Nathaniel Jennison married Mehitable. August 24th, 1774, the Worcester mob threatened the safety of loyalists John Murray and John Chandler, and they ran, deserting their properties and their obligations. Without their protection, Jennison was able to take advantage of the Caldwell children and the Walker family just when they needed protection the most. October 14th, 1774, William, the only surviving Caldwell son, was without a guardian because John Murray had gone to parts unknown. At age 14, he was legally able to choose his own guardian, and he chose his former stepfather, Nathaniel Jennison. Whether he was coerced into this by Jennison, I don't know, but it gave Jennison undue influence, and it probably allowed Nathaniel Jennison and his new wife, Mehitable, to remain in the James Caldwell house. Next slide, please. When Quock Walker defied Nathaniel Jennison's enslavement by leaving him in 1781 to work for wages for John and Seth Caldwell, relatives of James Caldwell, the legal actions dragged on for 2 years until finally they reached the highest court in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court. The Cushing decision of 1783 led to the emancipation of all enslaved people in Massachusetts. It was a soft emancipation, one that had already started, as many enslavers could see the handwriting on the wall. By 1790, Massachusetts had no slaves. Next slide, please. Now, the bravery of Quock Walker and others like Elizabeth Freeman in fighting for emancipation was beneficial for most enslaved people in Massachusetts, but it was disastrous for Prince Walker. He was 9 years old. The story of Nathaniel Jennison selling him into slavery in Connecticut is told from several sources. One was a book published in Boston in 1856, 2 years before Prince died, so the author may have interviewed him. This book was called Anthony Burns, A History by Charles Emery Stevens. The author wrote about Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave who escaped from Virginia to Boston, but who was pursued by fugitive slave hunters under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In this book, Stevens wrote that after the Cushing decision of 1783, Jennison sold Quock's younger brother, Prince, to a man in East Windsor, Connecticut. Prince kept a reckoning of his age, and when he turned 21, escaped his master and returned to Barre. His master followed and made several attempts to recover Prince under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, enacted 2 years before his escape. So that is one story. Prince's daughter, Nancy M. Walker, told a similar story near the end of her very long life, naming the Connecticut enslaver as Watson, and Prince's neighbors in Barre verified that Prince told this same story frequently. Can we imagine the horror of Prince's mother, Dinah, when the family she had held together for so long under slavery was broken up, just as they should have been set free and been joyous about it. This slide is a scene from the movie 12 Years a Slave, which is the story of a free Black man, Solomon Northup, who was lured from his home in New York State in 1841 to play his violin in Washington, D.C. But in fact, he was kidnapped into slavery in the Deep South, where he stayed for 12 years. You will see that his story has some interesting parallels to that of Prince Walker. Next slide, please. So my goal over the past years, and that's many, many years, was to flesh out Prince Walker's amazing story, to fill in the facts and see if I could really verify that this all happened, and I believe I can do that. I traced Prince to the home of John Watson, a very wealthy merchant of East Windsor, Connecticut. John Watson built this magnificent mansion, 7,000 square feet, between 1788 and 90, when Prince was in his household. Its current address is 1876 Main Street in South Windsor, Connecticut. East Windsor Hill is now an historic district within South Windsor. We visited this place just a few days ago. The house looks great after 235 years. It is located about 1/2 mile east of the Connecticut River, facing west towards the river across large expanses of agricultural fields down Ferry Lane to Bissell's Ferry, which was in constant operation between 1641 and 1917. I was struck by the flatness of the land there as I gazed down to the river. How different this rock-free plain was from the hilly and rocky terrain at the James Caldwell farm in the Ware River Watershed. Well, now East Windsor was settled 150 years when Prince moved there, and Barre had only been settled for 45 years or so. There were other differences. East Windsor's lifeblood was its tobacco crop, which certainly was never grown in Barre. Even today in East Windsor, the fields are studded with tobacco barns. Watson's farm was considered to be the best cultivated place in Connecticut. The fields between the Watson house and the Connecticut River are still cultivated today. It looks like they grow perhaps corn and some grains and perhaps sod. John Watson was also known for raising and breeding horses and sheep. He may have grown flax and rye as well. John Watson had his fingers in many other pies too. Today, this is a very quiet and peaceful place. Main Street at the time that Prince lived there was bustling with activity. It was once the highway from the coast right up the Connecticut River to Springfield. And right across from this mansion was Bissell's Tavern, where the stagecoaches stopped every day, many times a day, and horses were changed. So it's not busy now because Main Street terminates where Route 5 goes through. They just cut it off about 3 buildings below this house. So it's only very fortunate that this house survived and wasn't destroyed for the highway. Next slide, please. This is a side view of the house, and it was considered pretty pretentious. As you see, the side door looks just like the front door, and a lot of people didn't like John Watson for that. Next slide, please. This is an aerial view from Google Maps. Route 5 slashes down on the right side of the slide, the double-lane, 4-lane highway. Near the bottom, John Windsor's house is circled in orange just to the left of the highway. You can see where Main Street terminates at the highway, and Ferry Lane slashes off from the lower right up to the upper left down to the Connecticut River. And you can see now that it's still very agricultural there. Next slide. And this is traveling down Ferry Lane to Bissell's Ferry. And there were thousands and thousands of Canada geese there and lots of hawks. Next slide, please. Bissell's Ferry, unfortunately, you can't really visit it. You can just about peek at the water on the left side of the sign. It's private property, but there's a historic sign and a very historic house. Just above here, the Scantic River flows into the Connecticut River, and that is where ships were built, and Prince's enslaver, John Watson, was involved in those shipbuilding activities too. Next slide, please. In addition to being a merchant and farmer in East Windsor, Watson was involved in shipbuilding, was a ship owner, and traded goods with the West Indies. As we can see from this 1788 advertisement for his store, he sold just about everything under the sun. Hardware, pewter, brass, glassware, crockery, groceries, refreshing liquors proper for all constitutions. And he took a lot of crops in payment. And note at the bottom, he has for sale excellent West India rum and molasses by the hogshead. Well, this means that John Watson traded with the West Indies in the ships that he owned or partly owned. And whether directly or not, John Watson was involved in the molasses to rum to slaves triangular trade that brought slaves to America. Watson was wealthy, a 1764 graduate of Yale College, and his mansion contained a fine library. John Watson could have educated Prince as some of his neighbors educated their slaves, but he didn't. We don't know what Prince did in service to John Watson, but it's unlikely that he worked in the fields. He was the only slave, so Watson apparently did not use slave labor in his fields. But some of Watson's advertisements, including this one at the very bottom, white pine boards, clapboards, etc., for sale, indicate that he dealt in lumber. And when Prince Walker came back to Barre and worked for his own money, he at times cut boards. So perhaps he actually did learn something living with John Watson. While living in the Watson household, Prince probably overheard conversations about the Connecticut Convention that met to ratify the new United States Constitution, because John Watson was a delegate to that in 1788. Watson was viewed as refined and scrupulously just by his peers, but I suspect that Prince Walker had a different view of John Watson. Prince was with Watson from the age of 9 years until just under 21 years. His 21st birthday would have been June 24th, 1795. The 1790 U.S. Census shows that John Watson had 11 people in his household, including 8 kids and 1 slave, and that was Prince Walker. Next slide, please. Well, Prince ran away before his 21st birthday because he knew that his enslavement in Connecticut would only be legal until he turned 21. And Prince was not naive enough to think that he was going to be set free when he was 21. No, he overheard John Watson's plan to sell him into slavery in Georgia, so Watson could make money off of Prince when he turned 21 rather than set him free and lose his investment. How similar to the case of Nathaniel Jennison selling Prince Walker into slavery in Connecticut when it became illegal in Massachusetts. Knowing that he could never escape slavery if he ended up in Georgia, Prince had to quickly leave Connecticut to escape that fate. Prince self-emancipated, meaning that he walked away from the situation and took his life into his own hands. He did this at the beginning of May 1795, about 7 weeks before his 21st birthday. The advertisement you see here in the Connecticut Current by Watson offered a reward for Prince's return, very much like the ad that Isabel Caldwell issued for Prince's father, Mingo, some 30 years before. It seems that John Watson was particularly irritated that Prince Walker went off with some clothing and a fiddle. Now remember this fiddle. I believe that Watson said that Prince was nearly 20 years of age instead of nearly 21, because obviously it would be illegal for John Watson to own him when he turned 21, and saying he was a year younger gave Watson more time to recover Prince and make some money off of him. According to Mary Harwood of Barre, who wrote an essay on Prince Walker in 1904 when she was 16 years old, Prince waded or swam across the Connecticut River and walked back to Barre. How could he know the way? He left at the age of 9 and had been gone for 12 years. Is it possible that somehow family members stayed in contact over the years? Some things we may never know. Next slide, please. This old topographic map shows the Connecticut River going down just to the left of center. Right about center, Main Street of East Windsor goes up. Prince lived just about between the words East and Windsor, there on Main Street, where Ferry Lane goes down to Bissell's Ferry. And notice the Scantic River flowing from the upper right over to the left into the Connecticut River. This is where the ships were built by Watson and others to go down the Connecticut in trade. In planning his escape, Prince knew that he could not get on a stagecoach or vehicle near Watson's home. Everybody saw him there every day. They would recognize him and turn him in. He could not go to the river and get on a ship because everyone would know that his enslaver was part owner and they would recognize him. So Prince headed north up Main Street, and he probably waded across the Scantic River, not the Connecticut River, as some people thought. Prince knew that his enslaver would quickly alert people in the area to his disappearance and advertise in the newspapers. He had to make a route back to Barre that avoided anyone in his enslaver's realm of acquaintances. Next slide, please. So this is from Google Maps, and I asked Google Maps how long it would take me to walk the 53 miles from East Windsor to Barre to the Historical Society. And it said 19 hours and 5 minutes. Others said 9 hours, 37 minutes. Well, these estimates, I think, are pretty optimistic and might apply to somebody who had good hiking shoes and a lifetime of good nutrition. Anyway, it was a remarkable accomplishment, however Prince Walker did it. For a youth to find his childhood home that he had not seen for 12 years, his mother and his siblings. Next slide, please. Back in Barre, Prince adopted the surname Walker, first taken by his older brother Quock during his trials for freedom in 1781. Prince returned in time to reunite with his mother Dinah, who died in 1799. He was listed as the head of household in the 1800 United Census, and he worked around town as a laborer. On June 10th, 1803, Prince Walker became a landowner in Barre. Although now free, he still was threatened by fugitive slave hunters under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Yet Prince went on with his life and became a farmer. Prince purchased his first piece of property, which is 1.5 acres, from Submit Caldwell. She was the daughter of James and Isabel Caldwell, who was born several months after James Caldwell died. How ironic is that he bought land from the family of his family's enslavers. Both Submit Caldwell and Prince Walker had suffered as children from the greedy and callous actions of Nathaniel Jennison. Now they had another bond. Prince paid $18, or about $500 in today's currency. Prince told his neighbors, the Harwoods, that he purchased this property after it was revealed to him in a dream. His first marriage was to Betsy Dawes of Rutland on Christmas Day, 1805. Betsy was probably the daughter of Cato Dawes of Rutland, a veteran of the Revolutionary War and a landowner in Rutland. For a few short years, they lived together on the remote hilltop in the Ware River Watershed, where Prince had purchased his land of Submit Caldwell. Next slide, please. This is an excerpt of the 1835 map of Barre, the far east corner, that diamond corner. The yellow outline is my estimate of the extent of the original James Caldwell estate of 1,152 acres. We see the Ware River coming down through the bottom. James Caldwell's house is circled in green, and Prince Walker's is about 1.7 miles above it, still within that yellow boundary of the original James Caldwell estate. It was a long legal battle against Nathaniel Jennison, but the three surviving Caldwell children, Sarah, William, and Submit, finally claimed the land they received from their father's estate about 25 years after his death. They eventually sold most of it, which is why it was available to Prince. Next slide, please. Sadly, Prince's first wife, Betsy, died in February 1809 after less than 4 years of marriage at the age of 23. And this is an excerpt from the first parish records of Barre. We believe that Betsy's death was the reason that Prince started his little burial ground on the knoll across the brook from the knoll on which he built his primitive house. Much of what we know about Prince's life on his farm in Barre in the Ware River Watershed off of Gilbert Road, between Gilbert Road and Sunrise Avenue, comes to us from descendants of the Harwood family. There were several Harwood families, branches of the family, which lived nearby. Mary Harwood, when about 16 years old in 1904, wrote of the funeral of Prince's first wife, Betsy. These stories, she was not alive, but they were passed down by her grandfather, her father, and her uncles. When his wife died, Captain Charles Sibley was conductor of the funeral. Prince called him quartermaster. The Reverend Mr. Thompson officiated. He went up to Prince and said, "Well, Prince, do you feel prepared to meet your trouble?" Prince answered, "Yes, pretty well. I've got 2 quarts." And we can presume that those 2 quarts were full of rum. Next screen, please. This is the Prince Walker burial ground from the hill going up to it, from the little brook that separates it from where Prince Walker lived on the other knoll. The sign was added to the burial ground in 2017 by the Barre Cemetery Commission. Prince's is the only grave there with a name on it. There are several other stones with no names, and we assume one of them is Betsy's. Prince remarried in 1816. The marriage was recorded in the first parish of Barre as Prince Walker and Anna Morse of Barre, November 28, 1816. Anna's origins are somewhat hazy. Her death record in 1864 states that her maiden name was Field, and that she came from Worcester and was born on June 11th, 1799. Barre records usually refer to her as Morse rather than Field, as her death record said, implying she had a first marriage, but she was only 17 years old when she married the 42-year-old Prince Walker. I believe that Anna was probably the mother of the 10 children. 6 of them survived to adulthood. Before marrying Anna, Prince purchased an additional 6 acres of land from Submit Caldwell in 1815. Eventually, Prince and Anna's relationship soured. By 1846, she had deserted the isolated hilltop cabin where she had born and raised 10 children, 4 of whom died. It was a difficult life there on the hill, and she left, bringing some of the children with her. Next slide, please. We don't know what Prince's house looked like. It was crude. This is actually a house in Hardwick, which has survived many years. All that is left of Prince Walker's home site up on the hill in the woods, in the Ware River Watershed, is a depression less than 20 feet square. It must have been a small place. From Mary Harwood, the teenage essayist, we know that he lived on a hill back of the old Perry Johnson place. His house was a 1-story building with a stone chimney, and it had no cellar under it. He had no stoves, but used the fireplace. There were lilac bushes about his house, and these lilac bushes are the only thing left to remind one that a house once stood there. He had a barn, and he used to keep one cow. The barn was standing until a few years ago when it was burned by a railroad fire. There was no well, so the family went down to a brook at the foot of the hill for their water. He got his living off of his farm and was very poor, but honest, and people gave him a good deal on account of his honesty. Prince was very ignorant. He was unable to read or write, but he could count a little. He had a stick upon which he could cut a notch each day, and then he would know what the seventh day came, for he would never work upon that seventh day. Also, Mary wrote, Prince was short, thick-set, and very black. And in the runaway slave ad that John Watson issued when Prince ran away, it said that he was 5.5 feet tall with broad shoulders, which after a lifetime of hard work and good eating probably became heavy set. Mary Harwood also described Prince's odd way of speaking, often confusing words or mispronouncing them, which may be why John Watson of Connecticut described Prince as speaking broken English in his runaway ad. Next slide, please. This photograph was taken during a walk to the Prince Walker home site that I led a couple of years ago for the Barre Historical Society. We are arranged around the depression where he once lived, so you can see it was really a small place, which at times might have been occupied by up to 12 people. And this was a one-story home, so conditions must have been pretty cramped. Mary Harwood's cousin, Charles Harwood, wrote that Prince, or Old Prince as he was familiarly called, was well known and looked upon kindly by the residents of the east part of town, although never regularly employed by any of the Harwoods or Larned Rice. He was a frequent caller at their kitchen doors announcing, "I's so hungry, my stomach is stuck to my backbone." He was assured of a good meal and some besides. In turn, Prince kept on the best of terms with the housewives by doing odd jobs that, for one reason or other, their husbands just forgot to do. Charles's cousin Mary wrote in her essay that Prince was a very hearty eater. Whenever he went anywhere and they asked him to eat, he generally did. After he had enough for 2 men, he would say that he was sorry he couldn't eat more, but when he was small and a slave, they fed him so little that his stomach didn't have a chance to grow. So I think from that we can assume that Prince also had a sense of humor. Next slide, please. This excerpt from the 1855 map of Barre shows that same eastern segment of Barre, and it shows the Burnshire River coming down through it and Route 62 going west to east across. There's a road next to the left of the Burnshire River, which is now Gilbert Road, and there is a little, you can just barely see the word school. That was Barre's number 11 schoolhouse. So although Prince Walker's family was very poor and lived in a remote part of Barre, Prince's children had an advantage that Prince never enjoyed. They got to go to school. They got an education right there at the number 11 District 1 room schoolhouse. This excerpt of the 1855 map shows that they probably had to walk quite a way down. Prince's house is not on it, but you will see right about in the center, P. Johnson. That was people called this the Perry Johnson Hill, and Prince's house was up above it. Prince's house was still there, but it was never accessible by a road, and I'm sure the map maker just missed it. The schoolhouse must have been quite a lively place at times because the Perry Johnson family had 21 children, and Prince had 10, and the families of the neighborhood generally had many kids. Next slide, please. This is a page from the ledger of the number 11 school for the winter term 1840 to 41, and it shows that there were 8 Johnson children attending it and 2 Walkers. The only Walker children were Enoch and William Prince. So while the Walker children attended the school sporadically, those who were living at the time of their father's death and who had reached their majority could all sign their names and were literate. George, who was still a minor, did not sign. Prince's children had varying degrees of success in their lives. Nancy Melinda Walker lived 95 plus years and served as a cook in various households across eastern Massachusetts. She was interviewed when she was 93 years old and a resident at the Webster Home Farm. Described as vigorous, she seems to have inherited her father's cheerful and flexible view of life. She could read and sew without glasses, even at 93 years of age. She provided some of the information about her father's difficult life, how he had people going after him from Connecticut and trying to take him back after he escaped slavery there. All who attended the interview were charmed as she sang a melody from her youth so many years ago in the Ware River Watershed in Barre. How I wish I knew what song she sang. Brothers Enoch and George were shoemakers. Brother William Prince had a rough start in life when he served time in prison for breaking into the Perry Johnson house. However, he also served as a private in the Civil War, and his name is on the African American Civil War Monument in Washington, D.C. George, the youngest, is the only child whom I have found to have children, but they died young, and I have discovered no living descendants of Prince Walker. Next slide, please. These show some receipts from the records of a Barre lawyer, Nathaniel Houghton. Part of his job was to collect debts, and he was collecting debts from Prince Walker to pay off to the people that Prince owed. From this, we can see on April 23rd, 1818, well, that's when Prince's son, Little John Walker, died. Prince paid to William McCulloch $1.50 for a coffin for Little John, who is also up in that burial ground. He also paid $1 for a silk bonnet, which was probably a mourning hat for Anna, the mother. We can see from these records kept by Nathaniel Houghton that Prince repaid these debts by cutting wood and lumber for people and with bushels of potatoes. The Harwood family said that Prince would carve field stones into the shape of a gravestone and put them in the burial ground, but he had no money for having someone carve the inscriptions, and of course he could not read and write, so he could not do it himself. Next slide, please. Well, by 1842, things had soured between Anna and Prince. This advertisement in the Barre Gazette in 1846 shows that she had left him. Since Prince Walker was not literate, he must have had someone write this ad for him. Perhaps its colorful prose is reflective of Prince's personality. Caution, whereas my wife Anna has unblushingly left my bed and board without any color or shadow of reason except her own dark thoughts. This is to notify all persons not to trust her or any of her children on my account, unless they present an order in black and white, as I shall refuse to pay any scores which they may chalk up against me after this date. Prince Walker, Barre, October 16, 1846. Anna died in Oxford, Massachusetts in 1864, and she is buried there, according to her daughter, Nancy. The sign at the Prince Walker burial ground says she is buried there, but this is unlikely. Next slide, please. Well, the next year things were even worse. Prince was living alone at the age of 73 in his hillside home. Once again, this advertisement reveals quite a bit about his personality and circumstances. I don't know if he got any responses to this ad. Notice, the subscriber, being 73 years of age, wishes for a clever, honest Negro woman to take charge of his household affairs, his wife having left him about a year since, and to take care of him during the winter. He wishes for one to smooth the pillow of his declining years, that he may rest his hoary head peacefully and to enjoy the remainder of his days with that calm resignation to which he has so long aspired. Those who bring certificates of their conduct from members of the first circle of society will have the preference. Prince Walker, Barre, 10th month, 15th day, 1847. Next slide, please. Prince died on April 21, 1858. This article in the Barre Gazette is a bigger article about his death than most of the higher class citizens of Barre would get when they died. Prince Walker, better known as Little Prince, a colored man, died at his residence in the easterly part of this town last Friday. Various opinions are entertained as to his age, some persons averring that he was upwards of 100 years old, but we learn from what we consider good authority that his true age at the time of his death was 84 years. Prince was born a slave in this town, where he remained some time when his master took him to the state of Connecticut and sold him, after which he escaped from slavery and returned to this town, where he has since resided, leading a quiet and inoffensive life up to the time of his death. In the death record, it attributes his death to the infirmities of age at 84 years. In the last years of Prince's life, his neighbors, the Harwood and Rice families, claim that their families looked after Prince's welfare in a kind of a general and indirect way, seeing that his most basic needs were met if something happened. 4 years before Prince died, Prince took action to ensure that his small family burial ground would not be forgotten up on the hill. He offered it to the town of Barre in 1854, and the town accepted it at a town meeting in 1855. Although uneducated, Prince Walker must have learned a lesson by what happened to the Caldwell family when James Caldwell died in the prime of his life without a will. Prince made a will in which he mentioned his 6 living children, his desire for a funeral, and his wish that one or more of his children take over his real estate because he would prefer that it stay in the family than to be sold to a stranger. Sadly, this was not to be. After an inventory of his assets versus his debts, it was determined that Prince Walker's estate was insolvent. His personal and real property would have to be sold to satisfy Prince's debts. Next slide, please. And this was a notice that appeared in the Barre Gazette in 1859 in February, showing that his real estate would be auctioned off on the 8th day of March at 1 o'clock. 7 acres of land, all under cultivation, with a barn and a number of various kinds of fruit trees on the same. Prince's lengthy probate record provides important information about his life and his lifestyle on his 7-acre farm. We can see that he had various fruit trees. The barn was still standing in 1859, but the house was not, although it probably came down right after he died. The real estate in the inventory was valued at only $110, or about $4,200 in today's values. The inventory done of Prince's belongings after he died shows that he owned a pine table and 4 chairs, 2 chests and some drawers, a cast iron sink, 2 pails, a looking glass iron kettle, the contents of a cupboard, a few farming tools, a ladder, and 1 lot of hay. Also notably was a violin that was valued at 37 cents, considerably higher than the 4 chairs at a total of 20 cents or the 2 chests at a total of 25 cents. At an auction of his personal property held at his home site, neighbors and 1 daughter gathered to purchase the goods. Daughter Sarah bought a washboard for 13 cents. Harwoods, Rices, Tuckers, Reynolds, Desfords, and Maynards all bid on items that they probably did not need. Other than 1 lot of new hay, the only item that brought in more than $1 was the violin, which Larned Rice bought for $1.75. I feel that this was the same fiddle that Prince took from John Watson when he escaped from Connecticut a lifetime before. In my mind, I envision Prince Walker playing that fiddle on long nights in his lonely house on the hillside. Perhaps he played the same tune that his daughter Nancy sang to the people at the Webster home farm when she was 93 years old. Next slide, please. This is the Prince Walker Burial Ground. Once again, a talk I led for the Barre Historical Society. You can see it is on a steeply sloping hill. It's a bit challenging. Through an oversight, the generous donation by Prince Walker of his burial ground to the town of Barre did not get recorded in 1854 as it should have been. The Harwood brothers, who had a lumbering company nearby, purchased Prince Walker's land, and it was lumbered for many years and basically cleared of trees. In the 1930s, the state purchased this land as part of the Ware River Watershed. About 1949, some auditor in the state was reviewing deeds and realized that a cemetery had been included in the purchase of the Ware River Watershed, and for this watershed, cemeteries had not been included. So the deed was transferred back to the town of Barre in 1949, 95 years after Prince Walker had wanted it to be done. While the Harwoods still lived in the neighborhood, they kept the area clear of brush and brambles. But after they moved away or died, the cemetery became overgrown with brush. Due to the difficult access where no vehicles can get and this steep hillside, maintenance has often been deferred. So options are now being considered for the best way to ensure that the Prince Walker Burial Ground, the only remaining vestige of this amazing family in Barre, is properly preserved. Next slide, please. The painting you saw in the front slide is now hanging in a place of honor over the fireplace at the Barre Historical Society. We were able to locate the original painting and place it there. Researching, analyzing, interpreting, and writing and talking about the life of a man born 250 years ago into slavery is a challenge. When that person was enslaved with no birth record and no incentive for society to take note of his activities and appreciate them, it's very, very difficult. Somehow, Prince Walker managed to rise above his early life and the challenges there. He escaped enslavement. He escaped fugitive slave hunters. He gained the respect and the trust of his neighbors and his townspeople, despite having few material assets other than his farmland and a fiddle. The Barre Historical Society is proud to have this painting and proud to move forward with other organizations, the Barre Historical Commission, the Barre Cemetery Commission, DCR, Massachusetts Historical Commission, to make sure that Prince Walker's former property and his story are preserved. So thank you very much for listening to this story and for your interest in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy, for the great